I sat alone in the kitchen that Sunday, staring at two cold plates in front of me. It was my 64th birthday. My new wife was asleep in the bedroom, worn down by her chemotherapy treatment. And my daughter never showed up. No call, no message, just the echo of the last words she ever said to me almost 20 years ago. I hope your new wife gives you the son you always wanted. Those words still hurt more than any medical diagnosis I've ever received. Back then, I reacted terribly. I said horrible things, I yelled, I threw her out, told her she was a mistake, that she was no longer my daughter. And then, she vanished. Never reached out again. Until one day, a young caregiver named Chris showed up at my door, somehow knowing exactly where everything in my house was kept, somehow humming the same lullaby I used to sing to my daughter, somehow carrying a letter in his pocket addressed to me in her handwriting. Follow this channel for a story about family secrets, painful regrets, and the courage it takes to become who you truly are. Like and comment below to let me know where you're watching from, and stay tuned for a journey that might just break your heart before it heals it again. I sat alone in the kitchen that Sunday, staring at two cold plates in front of me. It was my 64th birthday. My new wife was asleep in the bedroom, worn down by her chemotherapy treatment. And my daughter never showed up. No call, no message, just the echo of the last word she ever said to me almost 20 years ago. I hope your new wife gives you the son you always wanted. Those words still hurt more than any medical diagnosis I've ever received. Back then, I reacted terribly. I said horrible things. I yelled, I accused, I threw her out, told her she was a mistake, that she embarrassed me, that she was no longer my daughter. And then, she vanished, never reached out again. I remember that day like it was yesterday. Molly stood in this very kitchen, her eyes red from crying, hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She just found out about my engagement to Rebecca, barely a year after her mother's funeral. "You couldn't even wait, could you?" she had screamed, her voice cracking. "Mom's barely cold in the ground." I should have been patient, should have understood her pain. Instead, I felt attacked, judged. 25 years of working 60-hour weeks at the construction company I'd built from nothing, providing everything she ever needed. And this was my thanks? A guilt trip for finally finding happiness again? "You don't get to decide when I move on," I had shouted back. "You have no idea what it's like to be alone at my age." That's when she said it. Words that cut deeper than any knife could. "I hope your new wife gives you the son you always wanted." The implication was clear. All those times I'd innocently mentioned wishing I'd had a son to take over the business someday. All those father-son baseball games I'd watched with a quiet longing. Molly had noticed, and in her pain, she'd weaponized it perfectly. My face had burned hot with rage. "Get out," I'd hissed. "You ungrateful little..." I said words no father should ever say. "You're no daughter of mine. Not anymore." She'd left without packing a bag, just walked out the door, slamming it so hard the family photo on the wall crashed to the floor, glass shattering across the hardwood, a perfect metaphor for what I'd just done to our relationship. And here I sat, 2 decades later, surrounded by the consequences of that moment. 20 birthdays, 20 Christmases, 20 Thanksgivings, all without her. I'd sent cards for years to her last known address. They always came back marked, "Return to sender." I'd tried calling the old numbers. They'd all been disconnected. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. Rebecca's family never visited. They blamed me for rushing her into marriage while she was still grieving her first husband. My friends from work had stopped calling years ago after I'd pushed them away during Rebecca's first diagnosis. I opened the door to find a young man standing there, tall, slender, with kind eyes and a reserved smile. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Hi, I'm Chris, the new caregiver the clinic sent over," he said, extending his hand. I stared at him, confused. Caregiver? I didn't request anyone. For Mrs. Rebecca Miller? Stage 4 pancreatic cancer? He checked his clipboard. "The doctor ordered home care 3 times a week. I'm supposed to start today." Of course. Dr. Patterson had mentioned this last week. With Rebecca's condition worsening, I couldn't manage everything alone anymore. I'd been too proud to admit it, but finally signed the paperwork. "Right, sorry, come in." I stepped aside, suddenly aware of my unshaven face and rumpled clothes. The house wasn't much better. Dishes piled in the sink, laundry unfolded on the couch. Chris didn't seem to notice or care. He moved with a quiet efficiency, setting down his bag and washing his hands immediately. "How's she doing today?" he asked. "Not good. The latest round hit her hard. She's been sleeping most of the weekend." He nodded knowingly. "That's common. Mind if I check on her?" As he headed toward the bedroom, I noticed something odd. He navigated my home as if he'd been here before. Didn't ask which room was hers. Didn't hesitate at the hallway junction. Just walked straight to the master bedroom like he knew exactly where to go. Little did I know that this polite, observant young man with the steady gaze and subtle smile was about to confront me with the greatest guilt of my life, and a truth I never imagined I'd have to face. When he emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, he had a strangely thoughtful expression on his face. "She's comfortable now," he said softly. I adjusted her pillows and gave her the scheduled pain medication. "She mentioned it was someone's birthday today?" I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "Mine." Chris's eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Sadness? It was gone before I could identify it. "Well, happy birthday, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice carrying an emotion I couldn't quite place. As he organized his medical supplies on my kitchen counter, I noticed his hands, slender fingers that moved with precision. Something about them seemed strangely familiar, though I couldn't place why. A faint scar across his right thumb, the way he aligned everything at perfect right angles, just like Molly used to do with her colored pencils when she drew. Chris arrived quietly, almost like a ghost entering my life. There was something unnerving about how naturally he slipped into our routine. By the end of his first week, it felt as though he'd always been there, moving through our home with a familiarity that both comforted and disturbed me. I watched him from the doorway as he gently helped Rebecca sit up in bed. His hands worked with practiced ease, adjusting pillows behind her back before carefully measuring her medication into a small paper cup. What struck me most wasn't his efficiency. It was the tenderness, the way he spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, the patience as she struggled to swallow her pills, the small act of tucking a stray hair behind her ear that seemed almost familial. "He has gentle hands," Rebecca told me later that evening when we were alone. Her voice was thin and raspy from the tumor pressing against her vocal cords. "Makes everything hurt less." I nodded, unsure why that observation left me with a hollow feeling in my chest. There was something about Chris I couldn't quite place, something in his mannerisms that triggered fragments of memory I couldn't fully grasp. The way he tilted his head when considering a question, how he absent-mindedly hummed old Beatles songs while organizing medications, the slight furrow between his eyebrows when concentrating. As the weeks passed, our silent house gradually filled with small moments of unexpected warmth. Rebecca laughed for the first time in months when Chris accidentally spilled cranberry juice on his scrubs and quipped that he looked like an extra from a horror movie. I found myself lingering in rooms longer, making excuses to be present during his visits, drawn to the calm energy he brought with him. It was during his 5th week with us that I finally broke the ice beyond professional pleasantries. "You're good at this," I said, watching him change Rebecca's IV with precision. "Been doing it long?" He kept his eyes on his work. "About 8 years now." "What made you choose this line of work?" I asked, genuinely curious. Most young men his age were chasing fortunes in tech or finance, not bathing terminal patients and managing pain medications. His hands stilled for just a moment. "Someone I loved suffered alone," he said quietly. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen to others if I could help it. That night, after Chris had left and Rebecca was sleeping, I found myself pulled toward the garage where I kept old photo albums stacked in dusty boxes. I hadn't looked at them in years. Too painful, too many reminders of Molly, of happier times that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I pulled out one from when Molly was 16, the last birthday we celebrated together before everything fell apart. I ran my finger over her face, so young and full of promise. The same determined chin, the same expressive eyes that could flash from joy to fury in an instant, just like mine. My stubborn, brilliant daughter who'd gotten a full scholarship to Cornell for engineering. The child who'd built a working model roller coaster for her 8th grade science fair. The teenager who'd fought me on everything from curfews to college applications, always pushing back, always challenging me. God, I missed her. 2 days later, I was making coffee when I caught sight of Chris through the kitchen window. He was sitting alone on our back porch steps during his break, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. I walked outside quietly and stood there awkwardly, unsure how to approach someone else's grief. "Everything okay?" I finally asked, immediately regretting the stupidity of the question. He straightened quickly, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Sorry, Mr. Miller. Just needed a minute." I sat down beside him, leaving enough space between us. "Bad day?" He shook his head. "Not really. Mrs. Miller had a good morning. She ate almost half her breakfast." "Then why?" I gestured vaguely at his tear-streaked face. Chris stared out at the overgrown garden that Rebecca had once tended with such care. "She reminds me of my mother," he said finally. "The way she fights through the pain, the dignity." He swallowed hard. "But my mom, she didn't have anyone to care for her at the end. Just me, and I was too young to know what to do." The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in me. Without thinking, I found myself talking about Molly. Stories I hadn't shared with anyone, not even Rebecca. "My daughter would have been about your age now," I said, my voice rough. "She was brilliant, stubborn as hell. We fought all the time, especially after her mother died. Then when I met Rebecca, I made mistakes, said terrible things I can never take back." Chris listened silently, his gaze fixed on the distance. "She said I always wanted a son instead of her," I continued, the words spilling out like poison from an old wound. "And the worst part is she wasn't entirely wrong. I did talk about wanting a son sometimes. Not instead of her, never instead of her, but I was thoughtless. And then when she threw it in my face, I told her she wasn't my daughter anymore. The memory made me physically ill, even after all these years." "Have you tried to find her?" Chris asked softly. "For years, but she disappeared completely. Changed her number, moved away. It's like she wanted to erase herself from my life completely." I took a shaky breath. Can't say I blame her. When I looked up, there was something strange in Chris's expression, a complex emotion I couldn't name. For just a moment, it seemed like he was about to say something important. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "She might still be listening, you know, even from a distance." Later that evening, I found Chris in the bathroom after checking on Rebecca. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see him gripping the edge of the sink, crying silently. When I asked him about it the next day, he just said, "I had a mother very much like her, but she didn't have anyone to take care of her." That phrase lodged in my chest like a splinter. Something about this young man made me think of the daughter I'd lost. But I didn't dare voice that thought aloud. It seemed too strange, too painful, and frankly too impossible to consider. Rain hammered against the windows that Saturday morning, creating a melancholy soundtrack that matched my mood. Rebecca had suffered through another difficult night, her pain breaking through even the strongest medications. By dawn, she'd finally fallen into a fitful sleep, leaving me exhausted but too wired to rest. The house felt oppressive, filled with the weight of unsaid things and fading hopes. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, straightening pictures, adjusting cushions, small, meaningless tasks to occupy my hands. In our bedroom, I noticed Rebecca's nightstand drawer slightly open. She kept her medications there, and I thought I should organize them before Chris arrived later that afternoon. When I pulled the drawer open fully, I found the usual cluster of orange prescription bottles, lip balm, and tissues. But as I started arranging things, my fingers brushed against something tucked in the very back, a worn photograph. Curious, I pulled it out. The moment I saw it, my heart stuttered in my chest. It was Molly. My Molly, about 8 years old, at a Yankees game. She was wearing that blue baseball cap I'd bought her, oversized on her small head, but she'd refused to get the child's size because she wanted the exact same one I had. Her smile was wide, gap-toothed from recently lost baby teeth, her eyes squinting against the summer sun. But the photograph had been cut, or rather, torn roughly down one side. The jagged edge sliced through where I should have been standing beside her, my arm around her shoulders. I had been removed from the picture, literally torn away. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the photo trembling in my hand. Why would Rebecca have this? I'd packed away all photos of Molly years ago, unable to bear the sight of the daughter I'd lost. And why was it torn? A distant memory surfaced. Molly, teenage and furious after our last fight, storming into my study where I kept family photos on the bookshelf. The sound of glass breaking. Her tearful voice. "If you don't want me as a daughter, I don't want you as a father." Had she torn this photo that day? Kept her half while discarding mine? But how had Rebecca gotten it? I turned the photo over. Nothing written on the back. just an old developing date stamp from Walgreens from 2001. Carefully, I tucked it into my shirt pocket, unsure why I felt the need to hide it. The rain continued its steady drumming as I moved to the kitchen to make coffee. My mind was a tangle of questions. Had Rebecca been in contact with Molly all these years? Why would she keep that from me? She knew how much I regretted what had happened, how many times I'd tried to find my daughter. By late afternoon, the storm had intensified. Wind howled around the eaves of our old Victorian house, rattling the windows in their frames. Chris arrived right on schedule despite the weather, shaking rain from his jacket in the entryway. "Nasty out there," he commented, hanging his wet coat on the rack. "How's Mrs. Miller today?" "Rough night," I replied, leading him toward the bedroom. "She's been sleeping on and off since morning." Chris nodded, his expression softening with understanding. "Those are the hardest days. Let me check on her, see if we can make her more comfortable." While he tended to Rebecca, I retreated to the living room, restless with unasked questions. Through the doorway, I watched as Chris worked, the gentle efficiency of his movements, the quiet murmur of his voice as he spoke to my wife. There was such familiarity in his care, as if he'd known her for years, not weeks. Later, as evening approached, I found Chris in the living room, carefully folding a stack of clean laundry I'd left in the basket. The mundane task shouldn't have held my attention, but something about his movements made me pause in the doorway. He picked up one of my old cardigans, shaking it out before folding it with precise movements. Then he reached for something blue in the pile, a baseball cap. My breath caught as I recognized it. The same Yankees cap from the photograph. The same one Molly had worn. Without thinking, I spoke. "Where did you get that?" Chris looked up, startled by my sudden question. The cap was halfway to the folded pile, held loosely in his hands. "This?" It was sitting on top of the dryer. "No," I said, stepping closer. "That cap, it's—" I stopped, unsure how to continue. It couldn't be the same one. That was impossible. There were millions of Yankees caps in the world, but as he turned it in his hands, I could see the slight fraying along the brim, the tiny stain on the left side from when Molly had dropped mustard on it all those years ago. Chris seemed to sense my confusion. He held the cap out to me. "Is everything okay, Mr. Miller?" I took it from him, turning it over in my hands. The inside band where I'd written Molly's name in permanent marker had been worn away almost completely, just the faintest shadow of letters remaining. "This belonged to my daughter," I said, my voice barely audible over the rain. "Where did you find it?" A shadow passed over Chris's face, quick but unmistakable. "I told you it was on the dryer. But before that," I pressed, feeling like I was grasping at something just beyond my reach. "Have you seen it before? It's very distinctive." Chris turned away, resuming his folding. His shoulders had tensed visibly. "It's just a baseball cap, Mr. Miller." But it wasn't. It was a direct link to the photograph I'd found that morning, to my daughter, to a past I couldn't reclaim. And somehow, impossibly, it was here in my home after all these years. "It was my sister's," Chris said suddenly, his back still to me. "She died." The words fell between us like stones. I stared at the back of his head, trying to process what he'd said. "Your sister?" I repeated. "Yes." His voice was flat, emotionless. "She died. The cap reminds me of her." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the storm outside. My daughter never had any siblings. And this cap, this exact cap, I had bought it myself at Yankee Stadium 20 years ago. One for me, one for Molly. A matched set. I wanted to challenge him, to demand explanations. But something held me back. Fear, perhaps. Or the growing sense that I was standing at the edge of a truth I wasn't prepared to face. Instead, I simply nodded, set the cap down, and retreated to check on Rebecca, the torn photograph burning in my pocket, like a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. 3 days passed after the incident with the baseball cap. 3 days of sidelong glances, careful conversations, and a strange tension that hovered between Chris and me like an uninvited guest. Rebecca's condition had stabilized somewhat. She was able to sit up for longer periods, even managed to eat a few bites of the chicken soup Chris had prepared from scratch. An old family recipe, he'd called it. The same recipe my first wife had made whenever Molly was sick. It was Tuesday, shift change day. Dr. Patterson had arranged for a night nurse to come 3 evenings a week so I could get some uninterrupted sleep. The routine was always the same. Chris would stay until 6 p.m., give his report to the night nurse, and leave until the following morning. That afternoon, Rain had given way to an unseasonably warm October day. Rebecca had asked to sit by the window in the living room, where patches of autumn sunlight dappled the hardwood floor. I'd settled her with blankets, medications, and the trashy romance novel she'd been working through for weeks now, reading a page or two between long naps. "You're hovering, James," she said, her voice weak but amused. "Go do something useful. I can still turn pages by myself." So I retreated to the kitchen where Chris was preparing medications for the evening shift. He worked with methodical precision, arranging pill bottles in neat rows, checking dosages against the chart from the hospital. I watched him from the doorway, studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as he concentrated. There was something in his face that nagged at me, like a word on the tip of my tongue that I couldn't quite grasp, something familiar in the set of his mouth, the angle of his cheekbones. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. "That must be Nurse Gladys," Chris said, glancing at his watch. "She's early today." I went to answer the door, greeted the stern-faced night nurse, and led her to Rebecca for introductions. By the time we returned to the kitchen, Chris was gathering his things, slipping his arms into his jacket. "Everything set for the night," he told Nurse Gladys. "Mrs. Miller had her 4 p.m. meds, and the next dose is laid out there for 8 p.m. She's been more alert today, managed about 4 ounces of soup at lunch." He delivered his report with professional detachment, but I noticed how his eyes kept darting to the window as if eager to escape. As he finished speaking, he patted his pockets, frowned, then glanced around the kitchen. "Has anyone seen my white coat? I think I left it hanging on the back of the chair." "I'll check the living room," I offered, grateful for something to do. I found his lab coat draped over the arm of the sofa. As I picked it up, something slipped from the pocket and fluttered to the floor. An envelope, yellowed with age, the corners softened from handling. I bent to retrieve it, and my heart stopped when I saw what was written on the front. My name, in handwriting I would recognize anywhere. Molly's handwriting. I stood frozen, the coat in one hand, the envelope in the other. The sound of voices from the kitchen seemed suddenly distant underwater. With trembling fingers, I turned the envelope over. It was unsealed, the flap simply tucked in. Before I could think better of it, I slid the letter out. The paper was thin, worn at the creases as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times. The date at the top was from 15 years ago, about 5 years after Molly had walked out of my life. "Dear Dad," it began. My vision blurred. I had to brace myself against the wall, legs suddenly weak beneath me. "If one day I come back, it won't be with the same face, and maybe you won't even recognize me, but I'll know who you are, and I'll take care of you, even if you never realize it." The words swam before my eyes. I read them again and then a third time, trying to make sense of them. What did she mean? Not with the same face, and take care of you. The letter continued. "I'm writing this from the hospital. Mom would be so disappointed in both of us. You for your cruelty. Me for still loving you despite it. The doctors say I'm healing well from the first surgery. There will be more, many more, before I become who I've always been inside. I don't know if I'll ever send this letter. Maybe it's enough just to write it, to imagine you reading it someday and finally understanding." It was signed simply M. My hands shook so violently that the paper rustled. Surgery? What surgery? And why would Chris have this letter? Unless, the thought that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness for days now crystallized with terrible clarity. The familiar mannerisms, the way he navigated our home, the baseball cap, and now this letter. Could Chris be? No, it was impossible, wasn't it? "Mr. Miller, did you find my coat?" Chris's voice from the doorway made me jump. I turned, the letter still in my hand, and saw his expression shift from polite inquiry to shock as his eyes fixed on the paper I held. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It fell out of your pocket," I said, my own voice strange to my ears. "It's addressed to me." All color drained from his face. For a moment he looked like he might bolt, or faint. Instead, he carefully closed the living room door, cutting us off from Rebecca and Nurse Gladys in the kitchen. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said finally. "Why do you have a letter from my daughter?" I demanded, even as another possibility took root in my mind, one so extraordinary that I could barely allow myself to consider it. Chris took a step back, his shoulders hitting the closed door. His professional composure had vanished completely, replaced by naked fear. "Please," he said. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," I pleaded, holding up the letter. What does she mean, not with the same face? Why do you have this? Have you been in contact with Molly? Do you know where she is? Each question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. I can't do this right now, he said finally. Mrs. Miller needs… Damn it, Chris. My voice rose, desperation overtaking caution. If you know anything about my daughter, you have to tell me. I've spent 20 years trying to find her, to apologize, to make things right. Something hardened in his expression then, a flash of anger or pain so raw that it silenced me. 20 years, he repeated softly. That's a long time to suddenly care, Mr. Miller. Before I could respond, the living room door opened. Nurse Gladys stood there, her stern face creased with disapproval. Is everything all right in here? Mrs. Miller can hear you shouting, and she's getting agitated. Chris seized the opportunity, snatching his coat from my hand and brushing past the nurse. I was just leaving. Everything Mrs. Miller needs is on the kitchen counter. I'll be back in the morning. And then he was gone, the front door closing with a definitive click behind him. I stood in the center of the living room, the letter still clutched in my hand, the floor seeming to shift beneath my feet. Whatever Chris was hiding, whatever connection he had to my daughter, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't let him walk away again without answers. I barely slept that night. Molly's letter lay on my nightstand, its words burning into my consciousness each time I closed my eyes. I kept returning to that one line. If one day I come back, it won't be with the same face. What could she have meant? And why would Chris have this letter? The questions churned in my mind, possibilities assembling and disassembling like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. By dawn, I'd settled on confronting Chris directly when he arrived for his morning shift. I needed answers, no matter how difficult they might be to hear. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The call came at 4:17 a.m. I was dozing fitfully in the armchair beside Rebecca's bed when her breathing changed. I knew that sound, had heard it once before, with my first wife. That ragged, labored gasping that signals the body's final struggle. I pressed the emergency button for the night nurse and took Rebecca's hand in mine. It was cold, so cold already. Hang on, sweetheart, I whispered, my voice breaking. Just hang on. Nurse Gladys bustled in, took one look at Rebecca, and immediately went into action. Oxygen mask, vital signs check, phone call to hospice. Should we call an ambulance? I asked, already knowing the answer. We had discussed this moment, Rebecca and I. No heroic measures, no hospitals, just comfort and dignity at the end. No, Mr. Miller, Nurse Gladys said gently. I've called the on-call hospice nurse and Dr. Patterson. They're on their way. She hesitated, then added, You might want to call anyone who should be here. There was no one to call. Rebecca's sister lived in Arizona, and they hadn't spoken in years. Her parents were long gone. Our friends had drifted away during the long months of her illness. There was just me and Chris. I need to call her caregiver, I said suddenly. He should be here. Nurse Gladys nodded, understanding in her eyes. Use my cell, she offered, handing it to me. The reception is better than the landline. I stepped into the hallway, scrolling through her recent calls until I found Chris's number. It rang 5 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. Chris, it's James Miller, I said, dispensing with pleasantries. Rebecca, I couldn't say the words. I'll be right there, he said immediately, all traces of sleep gone from his voice. 15 minutes. Tell her to hold on. While we waited, I sat beside Rebecca, holding her hand, whispering reassurances I wasn't sure she could hear. Her breathing grew more labored, each inhale a painful struggle, each exhale a whispered moan. The sunrise was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with pale pink when I heard the front door open and quick footsteps in the hallway. Chris appeared in the doorway, slightly disheveled, as if he'd dressed in haste. His eyes went immediately to Rebecca, assessing her condition with professional detachment that couldn't quite mask the personal concern underneath. How long has she been like this? He asked, moving to the bedside. About an hour, Nurse Gladys replied. Oxygen saturation is dropping steadily. Pulse is weak and irregular. Chris nodded, taking this in. Then he turned to me. Mr. Miller, would you like a moment alone with her? The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Nurse Gladys and Chris stepped into the hallway, pulling the door partially closed behind them. I leaned close to Rebecca's ear, my tears falling onto her pillow. I love you, I whispered. Thank you for these years. for your patience, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it. I swallowed hard. It's okay to go now. I'll be okay. A lie, but a necessary one. I had no idea how I would go on without her quiet strength, her gentle humor, her unwavering faith in second chances. Rebecca had been my redemption after I'd destroyed my relationship with Molly. She'd picked up the broken pieces of my life and helped me assemble them into something worth living again. And now she was leaving too. After a few minutes, I called Chris and Nurse Gladys back in. Chris moved to the opposite side of the bed, taking Rebecca's other hand in his. To my surprise, he began to speak softly. Not to me or Nurse Gladys, but to Rebecca. "The pain is almost over," he murmured. "You've been so brave for so long. It's okay to rest now." His voice was tender, intimate, as if he'd known her for years rather than weeks. "Everyone you've loved is waiting for you. All that light, all that love." I watched through my tears as he stroked her hand. This young man who had entered our lives so recently, yet seemed woven into the fabric of our home, as if he belonged there. There was something in his gentle ministrations that reminded me powerfully of how Molly had tended to her mother during her illness. The same attention to small comforts, the same murmured reassurances. Chris began to hum softly, a lullaby I recognized with a jolt. It was the same one I used to sing to Molly when she was small, an old folk song my own mother had sung to me. How could he know that melody? As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Rebecca took one final, rattling breath, and then was still. The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the ticking of the bedside clock. "She's gone," Nurse Gladys said quietly, checking for a pulse, and finding none. I felt myself crumple, grief overwhelming me like a physical weight. Chris moved around the bed and did something that shocked me. He put his arms around my shoulders, holding me as I sobbed. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that I didn't think to pull away. When I finally regained some composure, I looked up to find him crying too, silent tears tracking down his face. This wasn't the professional detachment of a healthcare worker who had seen many deaths. This was personal grief. "You cared about her," I said, my voice hoarse. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "More than you know." In the hours that followed, there was the expected flurry of activity. The hospice nurse arriving to pronounce the death officially, the funeral home coming to take Rebecca's body, phone calls to make arrangements. Chris stayed through it all, handling details I couldn't face, answering questions when my mind went blank with grief. It was late afternoon by the time the house fell quiet again. Chris moved through the rooms, gathering his nursing supplies, straightening things as he went. His movements were mechanical, his face set in lines of exhaustion. "You should go home," I told him. "Get some rest. Your job here is finished." He paused, his back to me. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I suppose it is." Something in his tone made me remember the letter, the confrontation we'd never had, but now didn't seem the time. We were both too raw, too exhausted by grief. "Will you come back tomorrow?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Just to tie up loose ends?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said finally. "One more day." As I watched him walk to his car, shoulders slumped with fatigue, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. Something about Chris, about the letter, about my daughter. Pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet assemble. But one truth was painfully clear. I was alone again, and this time, there was no Rebecca to help me find my way back from the darkness. The morning after Rebecca died, I woke to a house that felt hollowed out, as if grief had physically carved away parts of the structure. The silence was oppressive. No gentle beeping of medical equipment, no soft murmurs from the next room, no sounds of Chris moving efficiently through his nursing duties. Just silence, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and my own ragged breathing. I went through the motions of living. Showered, dressed, made coffee I couldn't taste. The funeral home had called, asking about service arrangements. I'd put them off, unable to think clearly enough to make decisions. There were other calls too. Dr. Patterson offering condolences, a hospice grief counselor checking in, Rebecca's insurance company needing death certificate information. I let them all go to voicemail. By noon, I found myself standing in our bedroom doorway, staring at the empty hospital bed where Rebecca had spent her final months. The sheets had been stripped, the medical equipment removed, but the impression of her small body remained on the mattress, a hollow that would never be filled again. A knock at the front door pulled me from my trance. I already knew who it would be. Chris stood on the porch, looking as exhausted as I felt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usual crisp appearance had given way to rumpled clothes and uncombed hair. He carried a small duffel bag over one shoulder. "I came to collect the rest of my things," he said, his voice subdued, "and to see how you're doing." I stepped aside to let him in, noticing how he hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it would commit him to something he wasn't ready for. "There's coffee," I offered lamely, gesturing toward the kitchen. He nodded, following me into the house. We moved awkwardly around each other in the kitchen, the easy rhythm we'd developed over the past weeks suddenly disrupted by Rebecca's absence, and by the unspoken questions between us. Chris gathered his remaining supplies: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, extra scrubs he'd kept in the hall closet. I watched him work, trying to reconcile this efficient young man with the possibility that had been growing in my mind since finding the letter. "I should check the medicine cabinet," he said, heading toward the bedroom. "Make sure all the prescription drugs are accounted for before I go." I followed him, standing in the doorway as he methodically counted pills, made notes on a clipboard. His hands were steady, professional, but I could see tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he avoided looking directly at me. "I found your sister's obituary," I said quietly. His hands stilled over the pill bottles. "I looked up Christine Matthews last night," I continued. "There was no obituary, no death certificate, no record of her existence at all." Slowly, he turned to face me. "Mr. Miller, the baseball cap, the letter, the way you knew this house, knew Rebecca's routines from day one." I took a deep breath. "Who are you really, Chris?" His professional mask slipped, revealing raw emotion beneath. Fear, certainly, but also something else. A desperate sort of hope, quickly suppressed. "I need to go," he said abruptly, shoving the clipboard into his bag. "I've documented everything for the hospice team. They'll send someone to collect the medical equipment tomorrow." He brushed past me, walking quickly toward the front door. I followed, a growing sense of urgency pushing me forward. "Please," I called after him. "If you know anything about my daughter." Chris yanked open the front door, nearly running down the porch steps. I pursued him across the lawn, my heart pounding with more than just exertion. 20 years of questions, of regret, of searching propelled me forward. "Chris, stop." He reached his car in the driveway, fumbling with his keys. I caught up to him, grabbing his arm perhaps harder than I intended. He flinched, jerking away from my touch. "Don't," he warned, his voice trembling. "Please, Mr. Miller, just let me go." "I can't," I said, desperation making my voice crack. "Not until you tell me the truth. That letter, why do you have a letter from my daughter? Do you know where she is? Is she okay? Please, I've been looking for her for 20 years. Something broke in his expression then, a dam of emotion giving way. He slumped against his car, the fight going out of him all at once. 20 years, he repeated softly, echoing our conversation from days ago. That's a long time to suddenly care. I've always cared, I insisted. I made a terrible mistake. I've spent every day since trying to find her to make it right. Chris stared at me, his gaze searching my face as if looking for proof of my sincerity. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a small photograph, another one I recognized instantly. Molly at her high school graduation, her smile bright with promise, the future still untarnished by my cruelty. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "It's mine," he said simply. "Did you know her? Were you friends?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "You still don't see it, do you?" And suddenly, looking at him in the harsh light of midday, I did see it. The shape of his eyes, her mother's eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, my jaw, the way his hands moved when he was upset, exactly like Molly's. "That's not possible," I breathed, taking an involuntary step back. "You can't be. I'm not your daughter anymore," he said, his voice steady despite the tears gathering in his eyes. "I was never your daughter. I was always your son trapped in a body that didn't match who I was inside. You just couldn't see it." The world tilted beneath my feet. I reached out to steady myself against the car, my mind racing to process what he was saying. "Molly?" The name felt wrong on my tongue even as I said it. "Chris," he corrected firmly. "My name is Chris." I made the transition after you threw me out, started hormones at 19, had my first surgery at 21. His voice grew quieter. It was what I'd always needed, even before our fight. But after what you said, that I wasn't your daughter anymore, I finally had the courage to become who I truly was. I sank to my knees on the driveway, overwhelmed. 20 years of searching, of imagining reunions, of rehearsing apologies. And my child had been right here, caring for my dying wife, watching me grieve, listening to my regrets. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice barely audible. Chris, my son, looked down at me, his expression a complex mixture of old pain and new uncertainty. Because you hated what I was even before you knew what I was becoming, he said softly. And when I saw the job listing for a caregiver for Rebecca Miller, I told myself I just wanted closure, to see the man who rejected me one last time, to confirm that walking away was the right choice. He swallowed hard. I never expected to care about her, or to see you suffering, or to find out you'd been looking for me all this time. I reached for him, a reflexive gesture born of decades of longing, but he stepped back, maintaining the distance between us. I'm not ready, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I was. That's why I came today. But seeing you like this, I can't. Not yet. Before I could respond, he slipped into his car, started the engine, and began to back down the driveway. Wait, I called, scrambling to my feet. Please, how can I reach you? Through the open car window, Chris looked at me one last time. I need time, he said. 20 years worth, maybe. And then he was gone, leaving me standing alone in the driveway. The ground beneath my feet forever changed. The week after Chris's revelation passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and paperwork, I moved through these tasks like a sleepwalker, my body present while my mind remained trapped in that moment in the driveway. My son. Not my daughter, but my son. The words kept replaying, reshaping my understanding of the past 20 years. Rebecca's service was small. A few neighbors, her book club friends, a couple of former colleagues. I stood at the front of the chapel, accepting condolences from people whose names I could barely remember. Every time the chapel door opened, I looked up, hoping to see Chris. He never came. After the last guests departed from the reception at my home, I found myself alone in the silence again. I wandered from room to room, glass of whiskey in hand, examining photographs of a life that suddenly seemed like it belonged to someone else. Pictures of Rebecca and me on vacation in Maine. Our wedding photo, just the two of us at the courthouse. An old family portrait from when Molly was 12, before the teenage rebellion, before the fighting, before everything fell apart. I studied Molly's face in that old photo. Had there been signs even then? Some indication of the struggle happening beneath the surface? I remembered how she'd always hated dresses, preferred pants and button-up shirts, how she'd cut her hair short in high school despite my protests that girls should have long hair, the constant battle over her appearance that I'd attributed to typical teenage rebellion, and then the final fight. Her hurt expression when I'd implied she wasn't the child I wanted. I hope your new wife gives you the son you always wanted. The words carried a different weight now, a different meaning than the simple teenage cruelty I'd assumed at the time. I'd driven my child away not once but twice, first as my daughter and then unknowingly as my son. In the morning, exhaustion and whiskey having finally granted me a few hours of restless sleep, I awoke with a sense of purpose. I needed to find Chris again to talk to him properly. But how? I had no address, no phone number. The hospice agency wouldn't release employee information, citing privacy regulations. All I had was a name, Chris Matthews, which might not even be real. My search led me to the piano in the living room. Rebecca had played occasionally, simple tunes that filled the house with warmth. Now I remembered what Chris had said. He sometimes played the same song Molly had played at 8 years old. I lifted the bench lid where Rebecca kept her sheet music. There, on top of the neatly stacked books, was a piece I didn't recognize, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The pages were worn, the corners dog-eared from frequent use. This hadn't been Rebecca's. She preferred simpler pieces. I flipped to the inside cover and felt my breath catch. In faded pencil, in a child's careful handwriting, property of Molly Miller, grade 3 recital. I ran my fingers over the inscription, a tangible connection to the child I'd lost. Had Chris left this here deliberately? A breadcrumb for me to find? I sat at the piano, setting the music on the stand. My fingers, stiff with age and disuse, picked out the opening notes haltingly. I hadn't played since college, but muscle memory slowly returned. The melody filled the empty house, bittersweet and haunting. As I played, memories flooded back. Molly practicing this same piece for weeks, tiny fingers stumbling over the difficult passages. Her triumphant smile when she finally mastered it. The way she'd beamed when I told her how proud I was. That had been before the fights, before the gulf between us widened into an unbridgeable chasm. When I finished playing, tears streamed down my face. I hadn't cried like this at Rebecca's funeral, but now, confronted with this echo of my lost child, the dam broke completely. In the following days, I threw myself into writing a letter to Chris. I drafted and redrafted, filling pages with apologies, explanations, pleas for another chance. The words never seemed adequate. How could I possibly express 20 years of regret, of searching, of longing? How could I explain that his revelation hadn't diminished my love but had only made me mourn the years we'd lost even more deeply? On the 7th night after Rebecca's funeral, I finally completed a letter that felt, if not perfect, at least honest. Raw and unfiltered, it exposed my failings without excuses. I wrote about my regret, my pride, my cowardice, about how I'd looked for Molly for years, hiring private investigators who always came back empty-handed, about how I'd kept her bedroom unchanged, a shrine to my greatest mistake. I wrote about Rebecca too, how she'd known about Molly, how she'd encouraged me to keep searching, how she'd been the one to suggest the baseball cap might mean something important. In hindsight, I wondered if she had suspected the truth about Chris from the beginning. Most importantly, I wrote about my son. Not the daughter I thought I'd had, but the son who had been there all along. If only I'd had the wisdom to see. I don't expect forgiveness, I concluded. I haven't earned it, but I want you to know that I see you now, truly see you. And I am so proud of the man you've become, even though I had no hand in helping you become him. That was all your courage, your strength. If you ever find room in your heart to allow me back into your life, even in the smallest way, I will spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of that gift. I signed it simply, Dad, hoping the word still held some meaning for him. The next morning, I placed the letter in an envelope and set it on Chris's pillow in the guest room, where he'd sometimes napped during his shifts. I didn't know if he would ever return to read it, didn't know if he would care what I had to say after all this time, but I needed to write the words, to put them somewhere he might find them if he ever chose to come back. That evening, I sat at the piano again, playing Claire de Lune over and over, letting the music fill the empty spaces of the house. When I finally stopped, my fingers aching, I thought I heard a sound at the front door. A key in the lock, perhaps. My heart leaped. I rushed to the entryway, hope surging through me, but there was no one there. Just the gathering darkness and the whisper of autumn leaves skittering across the porch. The hope that had momentarily buoyed me collapsed, leaving me hollow once more. I returned to the piano bench, closed the sheet music, and placed it carefully back in the bench storage. As I did, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small notation in the margin of the final page, written in a mature hand rather than a child's. A phone number, followed by 2 simple words, if ready. I stared at the digits, my hand trembling as I reached for my phone. Was I ready? Was he? After everything that had happened, could there be any path forward for us? I dialed the number, my heart pounding in my throat. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. This is Chris. Leave a message. His voice, adult, male, unfamiliar yet carrying echoes of the child I'd known, rendered me speechless. The beep sounded, and still I couldn't speak. What could I possibly say that wasn't already in the letter? What words could bridge 20 years of absence? In the end, I simply whispered, I'm ready when you are, and hung up. That night, for the first time since Rebecca died, since Chris drove away, I slept without nightmares. Whether it was exhaustion or the small comfort of having taken a step, however tiny, toward reconciliation, I couldn't say. I only knew that when morning came, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. Autumn deepened around me as October gave way to November. The maple tree in the front yard, the one I'd planted when Molly was born, shed its crimson leaves in swirling eddies across the lawn. I watched them fall from my seat by the living room window, where I'd taken to spending my mornings with coffee and silence. 3 weeks had passed since I'd called Chris's number. 3 weeks without a response. I hadn't tried calling again. Something told me that pushing would only drive him further away. Instead, I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on learning how to live in a house that now felt too large, too empty, too filled with ghosts. Rebecca's clothes still hung in the closet. I couldn't bring myself to pack them away yet, though the grief counselor I'd reluctantly started seeing suggested it might be a healthy step. "In your own time," she'd said. "There's no rule book for this." There was no rule book for any of it. Not for losing a wife, not for discovering your long-lost daughter was now your son, not for the peculiar limbo of waiting for a call that might never come. On the 4th Tuesday after Rebecca's funeral, I woke with the strange certainty that it was a significant day, though I couldn't immediately place why. I went through my morning routine mechanically: shower, shave, coffee. It wasn't until I was standing at the kitchen window watching the neighbor's cat slink along the fence line that I remembered. Tuesday had been our day, Molly's and mine. The one weekday when my construction business allowed me to pick her up from school. We'd get ice cream at Bridgman's no matter the weather, and she'd tell me about her day while chocolate dripped down her wrist. It had been our ritual, our special time, right up until those difficult teenage years when ice cream with Dad became embarrassingly uncool. Our last Tuesday together had been the day of our final fight, the day everything shattered beyond repair. Without conscious decision, I found myself driving to Wilson's Florist downtown. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the sweet, heavy scent of flowers enveloping me. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Wilson greeted me warmly from behind the counter. "How are you holding up?" News traveled fast in our small Minnesota town. Everyone knew about Rebecca. "One day at a time," I replied, the phrase worn smooth from repetition. "I need a rose, please." "A red one." She nodded, moving to the refrigerated case. "Just one?" "We have a lovely bouquet of mixed roses that—" "Just one," I confirmed. "The deepest red you have." She selected a perfect bloom, its petals velvety and dark as wine. "For Rebecca?" she asked gently as she wrapped the stem in green tissue. I hesitated. "No," I said finally. "For someone else I've lost." Back home, I placed the rose carefully in a bud vase filled with water. Then I carried it outside and set it on the gatepost at the entrance to our front walkway. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to do this, what message I thought it might send, or who would even see it. But something about the gesture felt right. A visible symbol of remembrance, of longing, of hope. The following Tuesday I did the same. And the next. And the next. For 52 weeks, a full year after Rebecca's death, I maintained this ritual. Each Tuesday, a single red rose on the gatepost. Through winter snows that froze the petals. Through spring rains that battered them. Through summer heat that wilted them before day's end. The neighbors must have thought I'd lost my mind. This old man placing a solitary flower at his gate week after week. Perhaps I had. Sometimes I sat on the porch afterward, watching the street as if expecting someone. Other times I'd retreat inside immediately, unable to bear the sight of another Tuesday passing without response. On particularly difficult days, I'd drive past the hospice office where Chris had worked, slowing as I scanned the parking lot for his car, that beat-up blue Honda with the dent in the rear bumper. I never saw it. The grief counselor suggested I was stuck in a pattern, that the roses were keeping me tethered to false hope. "It might be time to let go," she said gently, "to accept that your son may not be ready for reconciliation." But I couldn't stop. The roses were all I had left. My silent message to the world, to Chris, that I was still here, still waiting, still sorry. Then one morning, a year and a week after I'd begun my vigil, I opened my front door to find something unexpected on the gatepost. Not my red rose from the day before, that had been blown away in the night storm. Instead, there stood a single white rose, its petals still beaded with raindrops, luminous in the early light. My heart stopped, then raced. I moved down the walkway slowly, afraid this might be a mistake, a neighbor's misplaced flower, a coincidence that would crush me when revealed as meaningless. But as I drew closer, I saw it, a small note, protected from the rain in a plastic sleeve, attached to the stem with twine. My fingers trembled so violently I could barely unfold the paper. The message was brief, written in a strong, steady hand I didn't recognize, and yet somehow knew intimately. "I read your letter. I saw you trying. I can't come back yet, but I can breathe now without pain. Thank you for finally seeing me." It was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. I clutched the note to my chest, tears streaming down my weathered face, a strange sound escaping my throat, part laugh, part sob. After all this time, a response. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. A white rose to answer my red one, a small bridge across the vast gulf between us. That afternoon I drove to the hardware store and bought supplies. Paint, brushes, spackle. The guest room that had briefly been Chris's needed renovation. It had been decorated with Rebecca's taste in mind. Floral wallpaper, lace curtains. I spent the next week transforming it, painting the walls a deep blue, hanging simple blinds, assembling a desk by the window. Not too masculine, not making assumptions, but different. Changed. A room with possibility. When it was finished, I stood in the doorway, surveying my work. It wasn't a shrine like Molly's untouched bedroom had been. It wasn't a statement of expectation. It was simply a space where my son might someday feel comfortable, should he ever choose to visit. The following Tuesday, I placed my red rose on the gatepost as usual. The Tuesday after that, and the next. I had no idea if Chris saw them all, or any beyond that first white rose response. But still, I continued. The roses became my prayer, my meditation, my way of saying without words, I'm still here, I'm still trying, I still love you. Seasons changed, holidays passed. I spent Christmas alone. Though neighbors invited me to join their celebrations, I politely declined. The solitude was painful, but it was also honest. I wasn't ready to pretend at normalcy, at healing. Not yet. On a bitter January morning, I woke to find another white rose on the gatepost. No note this time, just the flower, somehow procured despite the season, its pale petals stark against the new-fallen snow. I brought it inside, placed it in a crystal vase, Rebecca's favorite, and set it on the kitchen table where I could see it as I drank my morning coffee. A second answer, a second acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something. A door not quite opened, but perhaps unlocked. And for now, that was enough to keep breathing, to keep hoping, to keep leaving my red roses like breadcrumbs leading home. As I place another red rose on the gatepost each Tuesday, I'm reminded that love isn't always about grand gestures or immediate forgiveness. Sometimes it's about quiet persistence, about showing up week after week, even when there's no guarantee of a response. The greatest regret of my life wasn't that my daughter became my son. It was that I lost 20 precious years with my child, because I couldn't see past my own expectations. What would you do if you discovered someone you loved had been right in front of you all along, but in a form you couldn't recognize? How many of us are missing connections because we're looking for someone who no longer exists, while ignoring who they've become? Sometimes the people we love most are hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to truly see them. And sometimes a single white rose on a gatepost is enough to keep hope alive. If this story touched you, please consider following this channel for more stories about family, identity, and the complicated journey of learning to accept both others and ourselves. Like and share with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to begin again, even after our worst mistakes. Because in the end, love isn't about holding on to who someone was, it's about embracing who they've become.